Welcome, educators. Thank you for joining me in this session, Biblical Truths of Individualized Learning. I am excited to show how God created us to act individually, told us to start schools, gave us a procedures manual, and how Jesus set the example, how churches in the New Testament followed through with individualized local church schools and homeschools. May this session be a blessing to you. Greetings. I am excited to give to you in this presentation highlights from a course in Philosophy of Individualization that I am preparing for A.C.E.'s Accelerated College of the Bible International. Before I get started, I should add that ACBI Distance Learning Program is convenient, it's flexible, and affordable, offering a 1-year certificate of training, a 2-year Associate of Applied Arts and Christian Education, and now, I am most excited, a 4-year Bachelor of Applied Science in Biblical Education degree. All of this features a double major in Bible and education, providing ongoing training for you and your staff, immerses each student in the philosophy of ACE's individualization, and offers practical, hands-on training of skills for organizing and administering local church school learning centers. It also equips students for leadership roles in church education programs for children and adults. This course that I am writing digs deep into the biblical basis of educational individualization and then adds historical evidence for the continuation from AD 100 all the way up into the present. This is a significant, and if I might say so, a consequential college course designed for all your school staff, validating the ACE philosophy and methodology. Today, my topic in this presentation is biblical truths of individualized learning. Now, I have selected several passages from Genesis all the way through Revelation, highlighting 8 points. So let us begin. First, the biblical truth of individualized learning begins with the way God designed us. In Genesis 1:27, it states, God created man in his own image. God's image in man is threefold: rational, involving reason; relational, that is social; and moral, that is the knowledge of right and wrong coming from the conscience. For example, Adam used his reason to name the animals. He was social in the relationship with his wife and children. And he was moral, choosing the wrong, but knowing the right. The application of these 3 reflections of God in man expresses individuality in 100 different ways in one's intellect, emotions, and will, all of which point to the uniqueness of each person. God created each one of us for individualized learning. He gave us a brain to use for common sense in our own well-being. God put us into marriages or families or churches or schools where relational teamwork is essential, God gave to all of us a conscience that approves the right and condemns the wrong. He gave the written revelation, the Bible, as a standard for understanding what is correct reasoning, proper relationships, and the basis for judging the good and the bad. Therefore, individualized learning is deeply rooted into the way God made us. We were created to learn using our mind and our heart. Oh, I love that point. Second, the biblical truth of individualized learning is recognized in God's selection of an individual to grow a nation. Summarizing, I might say, Genesis 18:17 through 19, the Lord said, "Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation. I know him, and he will command his children, and they shall keep the way of the Lord to do justice and judgment." The principle was that children must be instructed. The practice was keeping God's ways, not man's pathways. And the product, the end of the schooling, would be citizens who knew what justice and judgment are. Individualized tutoring occurred right away as Abraham took his son to Mount Moriah, instructing in the substitutionary atoning of sins by the blood sacrifice of an innocent animal. But there God gave the twofold curriculum content to be instructed. God gave it there in Genesis. The first of which was justice, meaning what is rightness, rectitude, the virtue of righteous character. This was the ethical, moral standard applied relationally to others and legally in our condition before God. Both of these applications focus on the individual. A.C.E. does exactly that, guiding students with 90 character traits. Oh my, what a study! The second curricular content that God gave Abraham was learning judgment, rendering a verdict of right and wrong, a verdict based upon the evidences that reflect the constitution of God's holiness, the Lord's way. The judgmental decision was rooted in the objective ways of God, who God is, not upon the subjective, ever-changing ways of culture, the ways of man. Nation building begins with the individualized school learning center that is Bible-centered. Now, when students are trained in the ways of the Lord, they will know that marriage is between one man and one woman for one lifetime. They will learn that God made individuals biologically to be either a boy or a girl. The decision was made by God, not us. And if God described biblical schooling to Abraham, then, I put it this way, he prescribed it to Moses. Therefore, I come to the third point, that the biblical truth of individualized learning is the method of God that he used when his nation was first starting their school. look at, for example, Deuteronomy 6, 5 through 7, and I summarize, "Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thine heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy might. And these words which I command thee this day shall be in thine heart, and thou shalt teach them diligently unto thy children." The method of schooling presented in the procedures manual, as I like to call it, of Deuteronomy 6 is that God's words are lovingly instructed from the believer's heart to the children learners. The passage, Deuteronomy, answers a multitude of questions about schooling. What is the one thing an educator is to do? Well, help students to learn. That's the Hebrew meaning of the word teach. Who is to be taught? Children, elementary children. How long is the instruction to go on? Well, all the days of thy life. That's lifelong commitment. Why is instruction important? Well, for the productive and healthier lives of children, emotionally, physically, spiritually. And what is the proper response to the truth of God's unity? 2 words, thou shalt. In other words, personal, individualistic commitment. And what are the requirements for obedience to knowing and loving God? Well, in part, it is internalizing God's words and then communicating them to students and then writing them out. Notice all the processes involved. What are the blessings that reward godly schooling? Well, better homes and better civil communities, houses full of good things and goodly cities. Read it for yourself there in Deuteronomy 6. And what are the warnings of those? What are the warnings if one chooses not to be biblically schooling his children? Well, the young people will leave the believing community and follow other gods. That's what the passage says. Whew, what a passage. What a procedures manual. Well, I come to the 4th point. The biblical truth of individualized learning is found in Psalm 78. The psalmist details the wonderful providential history of the nation, noting how God preserved them in the Red Sea crossing and in providing manna in the wilderness. But the psalmist is discouraged because the people fail to recognize God's goodness. Sounds like America today. To the psalmist, this dismal record was like dark sayings. However, the psalmist gives what I call a survival's guide of Psalm 78. And what is that? Well, by divine inspiration, he said the first generation gave the words of God to the next generation, because they would not hide them from their children. Why? Well, that the 3rd generation, the generation to come, verse 6, would also come to God by, notice, praising Him, knowing His strengths and His wondrous works, focusing schooling first on who God is, was the priority of the curriculum, along with instruction in the Scripture. And how long was the schooling to go on? Well, the unborn generation, the children which should come, would also declare the Scriptures to the 5th generation children. Why the multi-generational schools? Well, the psalmist says that the upcoming young children, young people, would set their hope in God, keep His commandments, and not forget them. The key was to soften the heart to the things of God. Today, this requires evangelism for our school students so that they would get saved and saved from their sins, and with a renewed heart choose to live for God wholeheartedly, following the example of their supervisor, mentor. This is how a family, a church, or a nation survives, like the nation Israel, surviving thousands of years. Multi-generational, godly, biblical schooling assumes, by the way, that parents will choose to have children, not selfishly living for themselves, piling up riches on earth. Raising godly children gives hope for the future. This brings me, fifth, to the New Testament for my next point. The biblical truth of individualized learning is demonstrated for us by God's Son, Jesus Christ. And in essence, God said, "Let me show you how biblical schooling should be accomplished." Jesus mentored the disciples, who were learners, both individually and in a group. A.C.E. supervisors do this in their learning centers and school playgrounds. Jesus was the instructor of learners. The Greek word for teaching means to cause to learn, not blab to bore in hour after hour of endless lecturing, making students into passive zombies. Jesus taught in the parable of the sower that there were 4 types of individual learners, and you instructors ought to recognize these 4. 1, those who were not listening but will do so if you do something to get them to listen. Number 2, those who initially get excited but their interest fades. And I ask, can you find a way to get their attention? 3rd, those that take it in, but then they're distracted. Can you take the time to approach them once again? And then 4th, there are those with an honest and a good heart who receive the truth and develop moral character traits. Can you carefully mentor them? On the night before his crucifixion, Jesus took time to communicate individually with the concerns of Peter, and then Thomas, and then Philip, and Judas, not Iscariot. Why don't you look at John 13 and 14? This is unbelievable to me that during this time of great tension, Jesus took the time to instruct individuals. God's principle of individuality was front and center in his earthly educational ministry. Jesus left this world saying, and I paraphrase, this is the way I like to put it, "Now you disciples, you go and cause all nations to learn what I caused you to learn." The focus was not about teaching as telling, but upon learning. Well, this brings me to my 6th point, and the study of New Testament backgrounds. It is the background of the synagogue, where we find, wow, a model school. The Jewish people applied Deuteronomy 6 and Psalm 78 to their present culture, and then established schools in every synagogue, where learning to read was prioritized and reading the scripture was required. students engaged in mastery-based learning and practical training in mathematics and astronomy. Yes, astronomy. They had to calculate the lunar months and the times of the Jewish feasts. This practical training continued in the home for girls and boys, learning domestic and vocational skills useful in the trades. Their learning centers were a buzz of activity, with students demonstrating that they had learned their lessons before moving on to the next study. What does that sound like? A.C.E. Yeah, that's right. These synagogue model schools became a means of perpetual, personal, national identity, active civic involvement, and educational system for all children, not just the well-heeled elite. Oh, how wonderful it would be if churches today would provide Christian schooling for all the children without charge, even as they already do for the Sunday school. They should be considering the children of the community as their mission field and provide biblical training. Well, by the way, these Jewish communities thrived, becoming leaders in the business world and known also for their academic accomplishments. Seventh, the biblical truth of individualized learning was practiced by the local churches in the book of Acts and taught in the apostolic letters to the assemblies of believers. For example, the Church of Jesus Christ grew from Jerusalem to Rome, with the first church school operating in Antioch, Acts chapter 13. And the Apostle Paul was one of the learning center instructors. I'd like to have been in that school. Paul's instructional method in Acts 17, which is a great study, like Psalm 78, was to reason with the students out of the scriptures, helping them to master the content by means of question and answer. Evidences from the Bible were given for truth claims. The printed text of the Bible became the curriculum. Instruction was not just an oral presentation. There are so many other examples. Acts 18 gives an illustration of adult training in a rather one-on-one method with Apollos. Acts chapter 19 tells of Paul setting up a private school, the school of Tyrannus in Ephesus. The book of Acts concludes with the innovative homeschool used to instruct those who came to him while under house arrest. Biblical schooling in the apostolic letters to the local churches involved leaders who were given the spiritual gift of instruction. Look at Ephesians 4, 7-11. James warns that not everyone ought to be schoolmasters. And Paul's leadership was enhanced because why? Because of the homeschooling of young Timothy, who from a child learned the Holy Scriptures, which brought about good works. 2 Timothy 3, 15-17. And in Hebrews 5, it reveals that there were levels of learning, some requiring elementary education with milk, and the upper learning center, if I might put it that way, to the deeper subjects of strong meat. Schools were more than one day a week because they required financial support. You study Galatians 6:6. And wherever Paul went, establishing churches, he was instructing the word in a schooling function. The last written words of the Apostle Paul ought to cause us to see that biblical schools in every local church are essential. Paul pleaded with Timothy that faithful men ought to be instructing in the church school learning centers, 2 Timothy 2:2. These were Paul's dying words, and I put it this way: start and maintain church school learning centers. Church schools developed leaders for the church and prepared missionaries to go and start more churches with schools. Today, when churches only become preaching centers, the New Testament pattern of education is lost. Well, I come to my last and 8th point. Revelation 2 and 3. Here, Jesus revealed how the philosophy and methodology of the biblical truth of individualized learning would be worked out through his churches. Viewing the 7 literal churches of Asia Minor as representative of all of church history, one sees that the outworking is always through a remnant of God's people. In the text, you will read, in all 7 churches, Jesus speaks of those who would be overcomers, indicating that there would be a continuous battle. He further indicated a remnant by addressing only those who had an ear to hear. The Apostolic Church was a remnant in the Roman Empire, using individualized schooling as a means of preserving the identity of the local church in the face of insurmountable odds. From A.D. 100 to the time of the Reformation, around 1500, God's church was under attack by false teachers who, unfortunately, became the world-class leaders of the established church. Continuously persecuted by the established state church, martyred for the faith, the godly believers persisted in applying the principle of individuality to a self-governing personal behavior and to self-governing churches holding fast to biblical truth and remaining undefiled. Today, the challenge to starting and continuing local church schools should not stop the remnant of God's people. Triumph through tribulation became a reality. How? Well, this reality came to pass in the Reformation era, when individually when individuality was made acceptable by the broad approval of the individualistic priesthood of the believer and the personal decision of justification by faith. These 2 principles of individuality, which had been preserved through church history, by the way, in the Free Remnant Church, has been detailed by Broadbent in his classic book, The Pilgrim Church, and also by Gunnar Weston, The Free Church Through the Ages. These are great classic books that are worthy to read. But at the time of the Reformation, when individualization was unleashed, it resulted in massive evangelistic efforts, worldwide missions, new educational opportunities, and a new experiment in self-governing representative American civil government, contrary to all the dictatorships and the monarchies of the ancient world. And although a satanic humanistic individualism spoiled the biblical truth of individuality, there is a sense that we ought to remember that it was not destroyed. It maybe have been ruined, but let's remember that accelerated Christian education's application of the biblical truth of individualized learning remains strong after more than 50 years of worldwide schooling. Now, let's review my 8 points. Number 1, God created us in His image to learn individually, rationally, relationally, morally. We were created to learn, Genesis 1. Number 2, God said children were to be trained in godly character traits, that is, justice, and how to know the difference between biblical right and biblical wrong, that is, judgment, in Genesis 18. Number 3, God's words, according to His procedures manual and lovingly instructed from the believer's heart to children's learners, are recognized right there in Deuteronomy 6. Number 4, God said in His survival's manual that believers were to start schools that lasted generation after generation after generation after generation after generation. Psalm 78. Number 5, Jesus focused on causing followers to become learners. This focus was not on teaching, but upon individual learning, discipleship. Number 6, Jewish synagogue schools became model educational institutions requiring mastery-based, Bible-centered, practical training of individuals. Number 7, local churches of the New Testament, just like the synagogue, emphasized education, starting and maintaining schools with biblical learning. And number 8, in church history, opposition did not stop the free remnant people of God's chosen ones from living the biblical truth of individualized learning personally or in their self-governing churches and self-governing communities. By the way, would you be interested in this college course when it becomes available? It will be offered not only as part of the Bachelor of Applied Science degree in biblical education, but also as a course provided with a certificate or as a separate audit course. For more information, please visit our website.